If there was one PC VR Oculus exclusive that I wish could be ported to standalone Quest 3 right now, then it would have to be Brass Tactics. Not only do I think this game is a forgotten gem of that time, not that it didn't get its fair share of acclaim when it was released, but I also think it's perfectly suited to the standalone VR platform of Quest. There are plenty of titles which rank alongside this: Lone Echo 1 and 2, Wilson's Heart, Edge of Nowhere, Kronos, the list goes on. But Brass Tactics is always the one that jumps out at me as being a prime candidate for a port, if only because it's one of the greats with a graphical aesthetic which seems it might make that jump more easily than some.
Immersed Robot.
Brass Tactics was among the pioneers of VR real-time strategy games. Released in 2018 as an Oculus exclusive, development actually began way back in 2015 when the developers, Hidden Path, pitched the game to Oculus. Mark Turano, founder of Hidden Path and lead designer of Age of Empires 2, made a clear and understandable premise: to create an RTS game with a miniature clockwork aesthetic. Inspiration for this premise came from the introduction to the HBO TV series Game of Thrones, but almost everything about the game itself was a relatively blank canvas. Initially, during the first few months of development, only one or two people worked on Brass Tactics. Virtual reality was a relatively new concept in modern game development. We need to remember that in 2015, an Oculus Kickstarter with a subsequent purchase by Facebook and some showcases by HTC and Sony on some upcoming products was really all that had happened in terms of significant movement in VR for a long time. So the small development team at Hidden Path wanted to first get an idea of how to handle scale, pace and the strategic gameplay involved in the title. Oculus had given Hidden Path plenty of prototyping time in order to properly investigate how an RTS would play in VR, encouraging them to just build a game that felt natural to play in VR rather than shoehorning 2D mechanics into a VR headset. After this period of experimentation, Patrick Lipo, lead designer at Hidden Path, mentions on his blog how the team formed a number of primary design goals in order to prioritise their feature set. These were accessible RTS gameplay, create a game that would be immediately recognisable as classic real-time strategy. Even as the trappings of VR transform the experience, our audience should feel comfortable and not intimidated by the mechanics or interface. Innovation in interaction. While the gameplay would be familiar, this RTS experience would evolve to take advantage of VR and the touch controllers, replacing cursors and menus with a tactile experience where players physically manipulated their environment and units to achieve victory. A tangible play space. Brass Tactics would be presented as an elaborate game made possible by wondrous clockwork creations. To keep the player immersed in the environment, we would not move or teleport the player, but rather present functionality via intricate machinery. Initially working with Oculus Rift DK2 headsets and without any touch controllers at that time, using a mouse to simulate interaction, they created multiple prototypes of how the map would present itself to the player. They came up with a number of different ideas. A terrain bowl with height-mapped terrain in a circular disc. Although this allowed the player to view things easily with everything close by, it was seen to be hard to understand and felt like being stuck inside a half globe and a regular terrain valley. Then there was a barrel terrain where the player was positioned inside a rotating cylinder. Again, this concept put many things within reach of the player, but testing found it to cause problems with motion sickness. A globe-style map gave a god game feel to interact in, but at the same time seemed to take away some of the tangibility of gameplay. An inverted globe, which was a similar concept to the barrel terrain prototype, whereby the player was positioned inside a huge sphere with the map surrounding them. However, like the barrel concept, this also caused issues with motion sickness. Then they came up with what was named a 4-point cloverleaf, which allowed various teleport locations scattered through a flat map area for the player to move between. Unfortunately, having set teleport locations meant that both players may want to occupy the same location at the same time on occasion. This, along with the disorientation associated when teleporting and automatically rotating at the same time, meant that it was eventually rejected. A linear map with a cutout, which was a variation of the 4-point cloverleaf idea, had each player in a fixed location looking over the map. This would have worked, but didn't allow players direct control over the units. The player would also be positioned a long way from the enemy base when making their final attack, ruining the triumphant moments of the game. A turntable idea was one of the favourites of the team initially. The player would rotate the map in front of them, allowing them to still remain close to the action, and the team felt that this type of approach might work better with a more urban, single city type of levels, so the dense buildings can be confined to a relatively small area. At the end of this initial prototyping stage, the development team had a much better idea of the scale of the world they wanted to create, but they were still working with a mouse in place of actual touch controllers. It was later, in March of 2016, that Hidden Path finally got access to some touch controllers, which added the final element of the game interaction. Wanting to focus on direct interaction with units and buildings by reaching out and touching them, the team finally moved away from the turntable idea in favour of a flat map with a grab and pull style movement. Still nervous about levels of VR comfort in players and not wanting to cause any issues with motion sickness, the developers were finally able to fully test this method of movement with motion controllers. The grab and pull mechanics allowed swift movement across the map without introducing any motion sickness in the same way mouse or controller thumbstick movement was more inclined to do. By this time, Hidden Path had generally settled on the map size and player movement, but were still carefully refining elements to get the correct feel of traversing the levels. Along with the development of this movement system, the team also had been working on some of the gameplay mechanics and the style of RTS they wanted to make. They had not settled on whether the player would control rigid army formations or use attack lanes. Before receiving the touch controllers, they continued to use mouse control to select units and set them moving towards a destination in a traditional RTS manner. However, after receiving the touch controllers in March, they were able to experiment far more with different methods of interacting with units. They prototyped various methods such as a laser pointer selection, a flashlight selection where the player had greater room for error compared to the laser pointer method, a lollipop selection method which added a consistently sized sphere at the bottom of the laser pointer which allowed players to paint over nearby units of their initial selection to select multiple units. They also had various methods of guiding units across the map with simple laser pointer direction before moving on to a hand selection and gaze-based direction pointer to guide where the player wanted the units to move. Eventually, the developers settled on a method of holding the trigger on the controller to select and paint multiple units if required before moving them and releasing the cursor over the map to send the units to that new location. Patrick Lipo writes in his blog, "It felt great. Selecting and directing felt physical. You felt like a commander directing your troops more than ever. You felt a little cool, in a Minority Report kind of way. Believe it or not, you even kind of looked cool playing the game. This is not a common thing in VR. We knew it was a bit strange, but we had a feeling in our gut that this was the right choice." By the end of spring 2016, Hidden Path had settled on the design for both the player movement and controlling combat units, but next on the list was defining the long-term strategy elements of gameplay such as unit creation and upgrades. They decided on a tower system for training units, which could be placed in set locations around the map. They were accessed and selected from a palette which was displayed when the player rotated their wrist. The entire interaction system was based on an ambidextrous approach, whereby either hand was able to access all required options from the palette. After working on a number of concepts, including a tiered version of the palette, the end result was a relatively simple circular palette for tower selection, angled so the players had a clear view of each building. Brass Tactics was beginning to take shape by this stage, and the team continued to work hard in refining all aspects of the game as 2016 came to a close. In February of 2017, after around 14 months of development, Brass Tactics was showcased at the Game Developers Conference. The launch date was announced initially for October the 19th of that same year, but was later delayed until February 22nd, 2018, to allow the development team additional time to introduce new units and expand the tech tree. An open beta was made available in January of 2018, allowing players to familiarise themselves with the game ahead of release. Upon launch, Brass Tactics received generally glowing reviews, with outlets and players alike commenting especially on the intuitive and original control method, as well as the outstanding translation of traditional RTS gameplay into a more immersive and interactive VR world. David Jagno at Upload VR said, Brass Tactics is a big step forward for RTS games in VR. The tactile feel of picking up, directing and interacting with units using your own hands is excellent, and the mixture of single player as well as both cooperative and competitive multiplayer all adds up to one of the most feature-rich strategy games we've seen yet. While Scott Hayden at Road to VR commented, Brass Tactics shows its maker's RTS pedigree in this visually stunning and well-balanced tabletop game. However, both also had criticisms around the lack of detailed story and the lack of depth and complexity in comparison to its non-VR counterparts. Nevertheless, as it stands even today, Brass Tactics still scores a very respectable 78 on Metacritic in early 2025. Revisiting Brass Tactics myself after all this time was a fantastic experience. I was a huge fan of the game back when it launched in 2018 and appreciated the short campaign and skirmishes of the single player aspect, but I also even enjoyed a few multiplayer matches in my time with it, something of a rarity for me. The game holds up incredibly well and remains, in my opinion, among the very best of what the RTS genre can offer in VR. While I agree with some of the criticisms in terms of the lack of story and overall depth of gameplay, it's still one of the most enjoyable and intuitive RTS games on the platform. Its accessibility to new players means that you can become relatively adept in a short amount of time, with layers of complexity added in slowly as you progress through the campaign. Running the game in 2025 on a Quest 3 wasn't necessarily a straightforward experience when I initially tried it. I had some issues with the VSync option in the Nvidia settings, causing issues with locking the game to 60 FPS regardless of refresh rate in the headset. And also, Virtual Desktop doesn't support running the game directly. If you run Steam VR through Virtual Desktop first, then launch the game through the Revive compatibility layer, link in the description, then that will resolve the issue. Alternatively, running the game through AirLink or Wired Link will also work. Brass Tactics is a true forgotten gem in my opinion, and one that seems to be mentioned only rarely in the age of a more standalone VR focused world. This isn't helped by the fact it's stranded on the Meta PC app like many of the other PC VR Oculus exclusives, beginning in 2016 and ending with the final release Lone Echo 2 in 2021. It almost feels inevitable that at some point in the future these games will become inaccessible for anyone who hasn't already purchased them. A Steam release for Brass Tactics and all the other PC VR games trapped on the Meta PC app would be a solution for this, but perhaps the incentive is simply not there for either the developers or Meta. It seems a shame that we might never see a Quest port of Brass Tactics either. It could introduce the game to a whole new wave of VR gamers who are unfamiliar with the title, but more than happy to part with the cash in return for a high quality experience like this game delivers. Regardless, Brass Tactics is still there for anyone interested and wanting to play one of the very best Oculus exclusives. Hardcore fans of the genre might find it limited in complexity and depth, but the presentation, art design and fluid gameplay still mark it high on my own list of favourite VR games. But that's it for this video. Please click on the like and subscribe to this channel if you would like to see more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.
Our forces are victorious.